Good evening and welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Ford Presidential Library, and thank you for coming out on a dark and slightly misty night. We're glad to have you with us for this first program of our 2014 programming year. Tonight's program is brought to you with the support of the National Archives and Records Administration, our parent agency, with additional support and a very important support from the Ford Presidential Foundation. We are very grateful to all of you who are members of Friends of Ford and contributors to the Ford Foundation, because your ongoing support makes possible programs like these, as well as our research travel grants and other educational programs. It's an honor for us to have the Foundation's Executive Director, Joe Calvaruso, and his wife here with us tonight because they're based on the other side of the state. Joe and Donna, welcome. Joe has led the foundation very ably and is really providing us with wonderful annual support. Tonight's program is being videotaped by U of M's Michigan Media. So when we get to the question and answer session at the end of the program, I would ask that you, if you have a question, you go to the microphone at the back of the center aisle so that your question can be included on the video that will later be shown on Ann Arbor cable television. And finally, the standard item of housekeeping. Before we start, would you please make sure your cell phones and other electronic devices are turned off. Professor Yanek Mieczkowski is no stranger to the Ford Library. In fact, given his multiple visits to do research or speak at the library or museum, he feels like a member of our archival staff family. And for yesterday and today, I have to say it felt like a family reunion. We are very pleased to have him back with us. Yanek first visited the Ford Library in 1992 after being awarded a grant from the Ford Presidential Foundation. This research enabled and supported his 1995 dissertation at Columbia titled Gerald Ford and America in the Age of Limits. Yanek was again awarded a Ford Foundation Research Travel Grant in 2003. This research led to his 2005 book titled Gerald Ford and the Challenges of the 70s. In that book, Yanek wrote that President Gerald Ford, during his 2.5 years in office, understood the intricacies of the national economy better than any other U.S. president. He also noted that the accomplishments of President Ford were all the more impressive, considering the shadow of Watergate that loomed large over the Ford presidency. Yanek is currently professor and chair of the history department at Dowling College on Long Island. He earned his undergraduate degree at Ithaca College in New York and his master's and doctorate in American history from Columbia University. Yanek has authored several books and a number of peer-reviewed journal articles, numerous book and encyclopedia chapters on presidents and the presidency, book reviews, conference papers, in all a very stellar academic career. In addition, he has been very active, and unusually so, in publishing in newspapers and on the internet, and has presented many invited guest lectures. Following the passing of President Ford at the end of 2006, Yanek did a number of radio and TV interviews and has continued to publish op-ed pieces about President Ford. Yanek's newest book, published by the Cornell University Press in 2013, is Eisenhower's Sputnik Moment, The Race for Space and World Prestige. He discussed it this fall at the Eisenhower Presidential Library and several other places in Kansas, and now it is our honor and privilege to have him back at the Ford Library in Ann Arbor. Yanek, come on back.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks so much. Well, thanks, Elaine, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming out tonight to hear me talk about Gerald Ford. And actually, more so about Eisenhower's Sputnik Moment. And I also want to thank the Ford Library and the Ford Foundation for inviting me here. As Elaine said, this is sort of like coming home for me. I've been here so often. I know the staff so well. I've been to a lot of presidential libraries by now, but the Ford Library is by far my favorite. So being here was sort of like a family reunion, and I really enjoy the staff here and being here. It's a marvelous resource that you have here in Ann Arbor. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out some real parallels and the connections between Ford and Eisenhower. Last time I was here standing at this very podium was 8.5 years ago to talk about Gerald Ford and the challenges of the 1970s. And I did want to start by pointing out some of the parallels between Ford and Eisenhower. This is a picture of Eisenhower and Ford in the White House when it was Congressman Gerald Ford, and one obvious parallel is their affinity for golf. They're both golf aficionados. In fact, when John and Jackie Kennedy first moved into the White House after Kennedy won the election, Jackie Kennedy noticed all these marks on the floor in the upstairs part of the residence. And so she asked the staff, what are these marks? Is this termite damage? And the staff told her, no, it's not termite damage. These are scruff marks from Eisenhower wearing his golf cleats inside the White House. So Ford, I think, had more sense not to wear his golf cleats inside the White House. More importantly, though, in 2001, when the 20th century was over, a reporter asked Gerald Ford whom he thought was the best president of the 20th century. And his response was Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was very fond of Eisenhower. He admired the fact that he presided over 8 years of peace and prosperity. He had a picture of Eisenhower brought to the cabinet room when he was president. When he retired to Rancho Mirage, California, he had a small portrait of Eisenhower in his office. He admired Eisenhower's ability to set goals and focus on goals over the long term. They also shared common core beliefs, political beliefs. Both believed very strongly in balancing the federal budget and reducing federal spending. Both believed in steady economic growth with low inflation, and also in keeping the military strong during the Cold War. They were both experts at using the veto, and that's something that's really lost today. Ford was very proud of his veto record, 66 vetoes in 2.5 years. Eisenhower in 8 years vetoed 181 bills. When I say that's something that's lost today, compare that with recent presidents. George W. Bush, in 8 years, just 12 vetoes. Obama, I think, has just vetoed 2 bills. So these were 2 presidents who were very deft at using the veto. I think what really impressed me also about both Ford and Eisenhower as presidents was their long-term focus. When Ford was in the Oval Office, he later spoke about how he was very conscious about what decisions he made would affect presidents and the country 10, 20, 30 years down the road. Eisenhower had the same kind of long-term focus. Eisenhower frequently talked about the long pull, as he called it, or the long haul of the Cold War, that the country had to husband its resources because it was in for a long, potentially half-century struggle with the Soviet Union. So this was a real statesman-like quality to both presidents. Now, Ford had a much more difficult time as president because the circumstances in the 1970s for this country were vastly different than the circumstances in the 1950s. You had high inflation, a deep recession, much deeper for Ford in 74, 75 than the 3 recessions Eisenhower had. You had the lingering energy crisis, the defeat after Vietnam. It wasn't clear if America was the preeminent country in the world anymore in the mid-1970s when Ford took office. That was much more different for Eisenhower in the 1950s. America was flush after the victory in World War II. You had a period of low inflation and steady economic growth. But there was one period in Eisenhower's presidency where doubts really crept in about whether America was preeminent. And that was right after Sputnik. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, Eisenhower's Sputnik moment, this period for the rest of Eisenhower's second term where he had this overhang of the Sputnik launch and what it meant. And whether it meant that the United States was no longer number 1 in the world. And so before I begin talking about this, I'd like to pose a question to all of you. Today, I think we think of this country as preeminent, but ask yourselves, what makes our country number 1 in the world? Or is it number 1? Not according to some people. This is a poll by the very well-respected Pew Research Center. They polled respondents in 29 different nations, and they asked these people of these 29 different nations around the world, who is the world's leading economic power? And I think you could see the trend of what has been happening over the past 5-6 years. In 2008, almost half of all respondents said the U.S. is the world's #1 economic power. But by 2013, that was down a little bit to 41%. Whereas for China, it was 20% in 2008 thinking China was the world's #1 economic power. And 5 years later, about a third of respondents did. So it seems like the trend lines for the U.S. and China in response to this question and the perception of who is the world's greatest economic power are heading in different directions. In fact, the London Economist predicts that by the year 2040, if not earlier, China's GDP, gross domestic product, will indeed have surpassed America's. So is this a good index of what makes a country #1 in the world, economic power? Does this measurement help or hurt America's global standing? Or is it the most accurate measure? The U.S. doesn't lead every category of greatness in the world. We aren't the most populous nation. We aren't the biggest geographically. The Winter Olympics are going to be next month. The U.S. doesn't usually come in first in number of gold medals in the Winter Olympics. It's usually Norway or Germany. So what's a good measure of the preeminent country in the world, greatness? I want to show you this. This is a list of the 10 tallest skyscrapers in the world in 1980. I think there should be something that should immediately jump out at you when you look at this list. This is a few years after Ford left office, during the Cold War. Every building except for one was an American building. Look at how things have changed. You can almost see the shift in global power, perhaps, preeminence, go to Asia or even the Middle East. But does this matter? Is having the tallest skyscrapers in the world a good index of global preeminence or global image? So what kind of categories are important to us to be #1 in, to assert America's global preeminence, to bolster our global standing? And also, importantly, and this is going to be the focus of what I'll talk to you tonight, where does space exploration fit in these categories of oneness or preeminence or asserting America's global power? So that's what I want to address tonight. Which of these categories matter to us? This is one of the principal issues that was at stake in the Cold War space race. The question of world prestige, global standing, America's image, permeated every event in the Cold War space race, from Sputnik all the way to the Apollo moon landings. So the Cold War consisted of a number of races I'll propose to you. There was the arms race, of course, which is the defining element, one of the defining elements of the Cold War. There was an economic race also. We don't have that word as much in our vocabulary, our lexicon, as the arms race, but really it was the economic race that determined the outcome of the Cold War. There was the space race. That's a catchy, rhyming phrase for the Cold War. But I'd also like to introduce the concept to you tonight of a prestige race between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. And one real category of competition in this prestige race was the space race. The space race was suffused with this element of prestige. And with this question of the prestige race came the question of presidential leadership, specifically the leadership of Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy. And what were their views on space and space policy? And what were their views on prestige? How best to bolster America's prestige in the Cold War? Was space a good way? So that's going to be one of the foci of my talk tonight. Before I get to this issue of a prestige race, I have, this is another thing I wanted to point out to you and relate what I'm talking about tonight to Ford. This is an article that appeared in 2010. There were some recently newly declassified State Department documents that, if you remember or are familiar with the Mayaguez crisis, when Cambodian pirates in May of 1975 captured the American merchant vessel, the SS Mayaguez, and Ford ordered the U.S. Marines to try to retake the Mayaguez when the Cambodians were holding American hostages, the crew hostage. These declassified documents indicated that one motive for sending in the Marines, for giving a strong military response, was America's prestige, which had taken a beating recently in the 1970s after the Vietnam War. And Henry Kissinger, Ford's Secretary of State, and also Ford's Vice President, Nelson Rockefeller, very strongly asserted that we have to have a strong, forceful response to assert America's prestige, to uphold America's image. So this issue of prestige is something that has always been around. It's very real. It might be harder to measure than, say, GDP, but it's a defining element of the Cold War. Before I get to this question of the prestige race, I do want to look at three questions. First of all, did the Sputnik satellite launch surprise Eisenhower? Did it shock him? Was he caught off guard by it? Secondly, what was his response to Sputnik as president? Third, what was the space race like under Eisenhower's leadership? It was something that permeated his whole second term as president. What was the outcome under Eisenhower? Did he lay a good foundation for NASA and for America's endeavors in the space race? And then lastly, I want to look at this concept that I've been introducing to you of a prestige race, and how were Kennedy's and Eisenhower's views on the notion of landing men on the moon. So first, I want to start with the question number one, the question of whether Sputnik shocked Eisenhower. Sputnik went up on October 4th, 1957, famous date in world history, the launching of the world's first satellite, artificial satellite, by the Soviet Union, Sputnik. October 4th in 1957 happened to be a Friday. On that Friday, Eisenhower went to Gettysburg, where he had a home. And he, I'm sure, anticipated a weekend of relaxation. On weekends, he would either go to Camp David, which he named after his grandson as well as his father, David Eisenhower, or to Gettysburg, which was just 20 minutes from Camp David. And you could visit Eisenhower's Gettysburg home. It's part of the National Park Service. He probably was looking forward to a relaxing weekend of tending after his steer, cooking, skeet shooting, golfing, some of the things he usually did. Media pundits immediately seized on the contrast there. And this exacerbated an image problem that Eisenhower had. Eisenhower had the image of as I've written here, a do-nothing, know-nothing president. Somebody who was very complacent, who liked to take it easy as president, delegate work and knowledge to his staff, be uninformed at press conferences, be off on the golf links, be goofing and golfing instead of being president. And media pundits immediately seized on the contrast between a relatively new, aggressive, hungry nation like the Soviet Union launching the world's first satellite and a belligerent leader like Nikita Khrushchev versus Eisenhower, a complacent, seemingly lazy president who had gone off to Gettysburg while the Soviet Union scored this major coup of launching Sputnik. So that contrast aggravated an image problem that Eisenhower had and existed. Of course, we as historians know that image wasn't true at all. Eisenhower was much more hands-on than it appeared at the time. This image problem was further exacerbated by Eisenhower's first press conference after Sputnik. 5 days later, reporters peppered Eisenhower with questions about Sputnik. They seemed very interested in this launch of the Soviet Sputnik satellite and what it meant. Eisenhower seemed strangely unfazed by it all, unperturbed, almost indifferent, like he didn't recognize the importance of it. One reporter asked Eisenhower about the national security implications of having this satellite whirling in the heavens up above. And Eisenhower said, quote, "It does not raise my apprehensions, not one iota." Was he serious? Or was this a case of a president trying to limit political damage, trying to downplay an event as a face-saving measure? In truth, he was being serious. Sputnik did not shock him. The previous year, in 1956, he had approved and begun U-2 spy plane overflights above the Soviet Union. So he had kept tabs on Soviet rocketry development. He knew that the Soviet Union was getting ready to launch a satellite. So he was not taken aback at all by Sputnik. What Eisenhower did not understand was why the media made such a hullabaloo over Sputnik. They saw it immediately as a race. This is a picture of Eisenhower golfing in Newport, Rhode Island. This was part of the image problem that Eisenhower had. This is an illustration of how the media immediately portrayed Sputnik, much to Eisenhower's frustration. You note the date on this. I live on Long Island. The newspaper there is Newsday. Saturday, October 5th, 1957, the day after Sputnik, Newsday is already calling this a space race and already labeling a winner. So, Russia. I don't know if Eisenhower personally saw this headline, but this was exactly the kind of thing that irritated him. The media making such much ado over this alleged space race, a competition. Eisenhower did not see this as a race. This is another illustration of media responses. This is, you'll see, I'll show you some, when you see in these slides some blue paper. This is a newspaper that I found at the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas. This is from a student newspaper, the Brown University Daily Herald. And the Brown University Daily Herald is already calling this, the day Sputnik was launched, the day the United States became a second power. So you see all this mourning in the media that the U.S. has slipped to a status of a second-rate nation because of the launch of Sputnik. You see media pundits making fun of Eisenhower's indifferent, lazy, apathetic response to Sputnik, or what it seemed to them like this. This is a cartoon by the Washington Post political cartoonist Herbert Bloch. And it shows him making fun of Eisenhower's response that it doesn't raise his apprehensions one iota. Please do not disturb one iota. Sputnik's in the background. I like this photo so much that I bought the rights for it and included it in my book. So this is the typical media response of Eisenhower being trapped within these kinds of caricatures of him as an aloof, hands-off, apathetic, do-nothing, know-nothing president. Eisenhower never saw this as a race. He had actually approved a U.S. satellite in 1955. And this is a very important concept, critical to understanding Eisenhower's stance on the space race. He approved a U.S. satellite as part of the International Geophysical Year. The International Geophysical Year wasn't actually a year, it was an 18-month period, and it was a project involving 67 countries around the world in which they would collaborate and share scientific information. And one of America's contributions to the IGY was to be a brand new satellite. And Eisenhower approved a Navy satellite called the Vanguard, which was to be built from scratch, brand new technology. One of his advisors called it ultra sophisticated. If Eisenhower, and he knew it would take time to build this satellite. If Eisenhower had seen the space race as a race, he wouldn't have done this. He would have picked a ready-made satellite, the Jupiter C, that the Army had. This was hardware that he could have just pulled off the shelf, and it probably would have pleased him because he was a West Point graduate to hand this project to the Army. But he didn't see America's space endeavors this way. In fact, to give you an idea of how ready and available the Jupiter C rocket was, in September of 1956, the Army tested the Jupiter C and sent up a Jupiter C rocket 500 miles up. That would have easily been enough to orbit a satellite. Outer space begins about 100 kilometers up, about 62 miles. So 500 miles was more than enough to orbit a satellite. So that would have been an easy way to win the space race, would have changed history. America, not the Soviet Union, would have been the first nation to orbit a satellite. And that orbiting probably would have occurred in September 1956, had Eisenhower seen this as a competition. Instead, he saw this as an open endeavor and part of the international geophysical year. So Sputnik didn't surprise Eisenhower or instill any kind of panic or fear in him that the U.S. was behind the Soviet Union. What did surprise him was this media uproar and a political uproar that accompanied it, because he feared that that could spill over into the public realm. It could excite Americans and worry Americans enough so that they would support higher military spending on rockets, on missiles that the U.S. didn't need. In other words, it would feed that military-industrial complex that Eisenhower so feared and wanted to avoid. And so that's what he saw as one of his main challenges after Sputnik, to keep the media and politicians who are clamoring after Sputnik from exercising and exciting the public in a way that was unnecessary, from exaggerating the importance, the scientific and technical importance of the Sputnik achievement. So this brings me to my second point. What was Eisenhower's response to Sputnik? He wasn't surprised by it, but he knew he had to do something about Sputnik because of the media and political uproar that followed it. One thing that Eisenhower did was to use a relatively new innovation in the 1950s, television. He turned to television and gave 2 national addresses in which he tried to show Americans that we were doing a lot in science and in national security, that there was no need to fear that we were behind the Soviet Union. His first television address he gave from the Oval Office, and what did he do? He showed the nose cone of that Jupiter-C rocket to indicate to Americans that we have tested a rocket that has gone up into space, and we are not behind the Soviet Union. In fact, one of the documents that I found here at the Ford Library was from Gerald Ford in the 1950s as a congressman, and he was advocating for space exploration, and he was looking into ways that the U.S. could use space exploration, and he talked about using ballistic missiles for freight and mail delivery. So this is obviously decades before the internet, but that's how some people envisioned the possibilities for space endeavors. And in this nose cone, they embedded a letter, and the letter survived intact. So I think this was the kind of thinking of far-ranging possibilities of rockets and missiles ascending far beyond the atmosphere and returning to Earth for freight and mail delivery that could reach all corners of the globe and could be done instantaneously. So this was one thing Eisenhower did to reach out to Americans after Sputnik, his television talks. Another thing Eisenhower did was to, I'll explain that in a second, was to sign legislation creating NASA. And he did this in 1958. And most Americans don't know this. Eisenhower, one of his reactions to Sputnik in 1958 was to help in the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And there were 2 aspects of NASA that were immediately important. One was that it gave space projects a home. Because before NASA, America's space projects resided basically in one place, the Pentagon. And NASA gave America's space endeavors a different home, in a civilian space agency. And to illustrate the importance of this and the confusion of having a welter of different space agencies and undefined control over who would take charge of space projects, I'll turn as a way of illustrating the difference that NASA made to popular culture. If any of you like watching old episodes of The Twilight Zone, there was a very famous episode in 1961 called The Invaders. And it was about this woman who lived alone in a remote area, in a home, almost in a desert-like area. And one evening, a spaceship lands on her home. And space aliens embark from the spaceship, and they go throughout her house, and they're these little guys, and they're zapping her with ray guns, and she's trying to beat them back with a broomstick. And at the end, she's bashing their spacecraft with a broomstick, and they focus in on the spacecraft, and you can see the lettering on the side. And it says, U.S. Air Force Space Probe. So it wasn't an alien. These aren't aliens at all. They're humans who descended upon an alien planet. What's important about that is not just this inversion of the expected that's so typical of Twilight Zone episodes. It's the fact that still in 1961, there was some confusion about who would do America's space exploration. Many people thought it would belong to the Air Force. But NASA, really starting in 1958, gave space projects for America a home. NASA started launching military satellites, communication satellites, weather satellites. It took charge of America's space program. It also helped create Project Mercury in 1959 that winnowed down 110 contestants into the Mercury 7 that included Scott Carpenter and John Glenn and Alan Shepard, the men who established a foothold for America in space into the 1960s. So that's what NASA accomplished, and that was one of Eisenhower's reactions another of Eisenhower's reactions to Sputnik. Another aspect of NASA that was very important, besides giving a home to America's space endeavors, was the fact that it was a civilian space agency, and Eisenhower liked to stress that. This was in contrast to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union space program was secretive and it closely allied with the military. They used military rockets to launch their satellites. They only publicized their successes. They never advertised their failures. In contrast, America's space program with NASA was very open. It was a civilian space agency. Americans, the media, knew about both NASA's and America's space program's failures as well as successes. Crowds could gather along what's called Florida's Space Coast near Cape Canaveral and watch launches, sometimes ending in spectacular failures. The Soviets' launch pad was in a remote desert area in the Kazakh Republic. One NASA engineer who was lucky or unlucky enough to visit it said it was the closest thing to being halfway to outer space that he could possibly imagine. So that's one contrast that Eisenhower liked to stress between the US and the Soviet Union. He felt that the difference in the way we approach space policy and our space program with a civilian agency versus in the Soviet Union a secretive space program reflected the essential difference between these two countries and societies during the Cold War. And so that was a big part of Eisenhower's reaction to Sputnik, establishing NASA. And that brings me to the next question that I posed to you at the beginning of my talk tonight. What was the space race like under Eisenhower? America did launch its first satellite 4 months after Sputnik. It was called Explorer 1. It launched it on January 30th, 1958. A much more technically sophisticated and scientifically important craft than Sputnik ever was. Explorer 1 discovered the Van Allen radiation belts encircling the Earth. It had a Geiger counter aboard. It measured cosmic rays in outer space. And this sort of set the model for America's satellites as a rule in general. They were much more technically sophisticated than Soviet satellites, and they made more scientific achievements and discoveries than Soviet satellites. In later years during Eisenhower's presidency, the U.S. launched satellites like TIROS that took the first pictures of cloud patterns and storms in the Earth's atmosphere. The U.S. Under Eisenhower launched communication satellites as well, navigation satellites. In 1960, very importantly, the U.S. launched Corona, the world's first spy satellite that provided intelligence for presidents leading up into the 1970s. This was something that Eisenhower couldn't publicize because of national security concerns. We didn't really know about Corona until the 1990s. And it must have frustrated Eisenhower to have to keep silent about things like Corona. But it certainly added to his legacy that we've discovered almost half a century after Eisenhower left office. So, who led the space race at the end of Eisenhower's presidency? When Eisenhower left office, the space satellite scorecard read 31-9. The US had launched 31 satellites. The Soviet Union had launched 9. Most people aren't aware of that. In fact, NASA would almost have you believe otherwise. If you ever go to Kennedy Space Center, one of the exhibits that you'll see is a videotape on the early years of the space race. And they talk about after Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth in 1961, the video's exact words are, and the U.S. fell even further behind. Even further behind. It makes for a dramatic story that the U.S. had to play catch-up to the Soviet Union, but it isn't factually accurate. It doesn't tell the complete truth about the space race. But the perception was, because of Sputnik and because of this lingering that's continued up until today, media perception that the U.S. was behind, most people didn't understand this. And John F. Kennedy in 1960 capitalized on this perception when he ran for president and charged that there was a missile gap between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It was one thing that helped him really have an advantage in the 1960 race. Of course, as Kennedy had to reveal once he became president, there was a missile gap. It was heavily in America's favor versus the Soviet Union. The charge during the 1960 campaign of a missile gap made Eisenhower furious. But actually, once again, he had to keep silent about it because he didn't want to divulge what he thought were sensitive national security concerns. So this brings me actually to my final point. There was a gap by the end of Eisenhower's presidency. And this had to do with what I introduced to you as the prestige race. There was a prestige gap between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And this gap existed because of Sputnik. Sputnik was an immense blow to Americans. While it didn't surprise Eisenhower, it surprised Americans and the media and politicians and Congress and governors around the country. The U.S. was supposed to be leading the Soviet Union in every category, in science and technology, in military strength, in the economy, in freedoms, in our values. These were all litmus tests of the U.S.'s superiority over the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And we were especially supposed to be leading the Soviet Union in technology. In fact, a standard Cold War fare were jokes about how crude Soviet technology was. One joke went like this: an American's in Red Square during the Cold War, and he's forgotten his watch. And he sees a big, burly Russian walking toward him with two suitcases. He stops him and he asks, "Excuse me, do you speak English, and can you tell me the time?" The Russian puts down his suitcases and said, "Yes." Looks at his watch and says, "It's 8:10. The American says, "Thank you very much, and good luck on your trip." And the Russian goes, "Trip?" And the American goes, "Well, your suitcases." The Russian goes, "Oh, these aren't suitcases. These are batteries for my watch." So this was typical of how Americans viewed Soviet technology. Crude, bulky. Americans respected the Soviet Union as a Cold War adversary, but there was this condescension towards Soviet technology. And so Sputnik came as a blow to Americans, a surprise to our feelings of superiority over the Soviet Union. The U.S. had suffered a setback in this prestige race. And the media and politicians lamented this setback in the prestige race. Let me read you some quotes from popular publications at the time. The New York Post said, quote, this was right after Sputnik, "For the first time we know what it feels like to be a have-not nation." The U.S. Information Agency reported that around the world, American prestige is viewed as having sustained a severe blow. The London Economist wrote that it is almost certain to be a Russian who would first land on the moon. If any of you were upset by what I said at the beginning of the lecture, that The Economist has predicted that by 2040, China will lead the U.S. in GDP, The Economist has been wrong before. But this typified the kind of fallout after Sputnik. And what compounded the blow of Sputnik was Little Rock. Sputnik came just 2 weeks after the Little Rock desegregation crisis in September of 1957. And the specter of segregation and racist mobs in Little Rock, Arkansas, made the U.S. look bad worldwide. And after Sputnik, for example, the CIA tried to suggest ways of, I have to find this document, sorry. the CIA tried to suggest ways of trying to recoup America's loss of prestige. This is a CIA document from January of 1958, so the U.S. is still smarting after Sputnik 4 months later. And the CIA suggests as one way to deal with the Sputnik fallout worldwide and the reversal of perceptions about American superiority, publicize a Negro scientist at Peaceful Uses Conference. The CIA writes, have a competent Negro scientist read a paper during the 1958 Geneva Conference on the peaceful uses of atomic energy. A photograph of the Negro reading this paper at the conference should be widely circulated in Afro-Asian countries, and especially in America, a Soviet propaganda organ, in the USSR, and equivalent publications in the satellites. And the rest of that suggestion is still redacted more than half a century later. I wonder what they suggested there. But you could see what the CIA is doing. The U.S. had suffered a blow in science and technology, with Little Rock and desegregation, so why not try to combine the two and refurbish America's image by having an African American read a science paper? So that was one way the government tried to deal with the post-Sputnik fallout. You could see other evidence of the U.S. decline in prestige. By 1960, this is a meeting in Cambridge, Massachusetts, devoted to the image of the U.S. abroad in science and technology. And you see there, they describe the general import of the presentation. Whoops. Okay. The general import of the presentation was that we were viewed by people in many countries, including some in Western Europe, our allies, as second to the Soviet Union and China in science. This was true for the intellectual elite as well as the public at large. Eisenhower vehemently denied that the U.S. had lost any of its prestige, and he actually showed flashes of the famous Eisenhower temper if anybody suggested that the U.S. had fallen behind the Soviet Union or had lost prestige because of Sputnik or the space race. I want to play you an excerpt from a press conference in 1960, and you'll hear a reporter, William McGaffin of the Chicago Daily News, ask Eisenhower, Mr. President, in view of the international prestige at stake, why are we not moving with a greater sense of urgency to catch up with Russia in the field of space exploration? Listen to Eisenhower's response when McGaffin asks this question.
Chicago Daily News. Mr. President, in view of the international prestige at stake, why are we not moving with a greater sense of urgency to catch up with Russia in the field of space exploration?
Just start at that again. How you started? How'd you start that?
I said in view of the international prestige at stake.
Is it?
Well, sir, do you not feel that it is?
Not particularly, no. We have got a record in 5 years in space exploration that is not only admirable, but I think is one to be proud of. Now, the Soviets have made some very spectacular achievements, but I don't think that we should begin to bow our heads in shame, because in a few years we have gotten up and gone past them in many fields of this work when they've been working on it ever since 1945.
So that was an accurate statement. The U.S. had gotten up and gone past the Soviet Union in many fields of space exploration, but Eisenhower had difficulty getting that across after the Soviet Union had scored this major achievement in Sputnik. One of the former Eisenhower administration members whom I interviewed for this book was Dr. Bill Ewald, who was a speechwriter for Eisenhower. He helped Eisenhower work on his memoirs during the 1960s in Gettysburg, and has also published a couple of books on Eisenhower, including the excellent Eisenhower, the President, Crucial Days. And I'll never forget what Bill Ewald said when I asked him about Eisenhower's feeling about the space race and prestige. And the space race having the possibility of enhancing prestige. Bill Ewald said, that idea just left Eisenhower cold. He just didn't buy into it, that space endeavors could help bolster America's prestige around the world. In other words, Eisenhower, and you could see by the way he responded to that press conference question, did not see space as a litmus test for America's image or prestige around the world. And so Eisenhower, in trying to respond to Sputnik, would mention various things. He would say, for example, that the U.S. should concentrate on carefully selected fields in space activity and not scatter our efforts across the board. Frequently after Sputnik, in interviews or at cabinet meetings, Eisenhower would say something like this: the U.S. cannot be first in everything. We have to pick areas that are important to us and make sure we are first in those. And we shouldn't scatter our efforts across the board, dilute our efforts. We can't be first in everything. We have to pick areas of competition that matter and make sure that the U.S. Win in those areas. This is almost like the old General Eisenhower thinking, talking about winning a military battle. The important contests, make them priorities. And Eisenhower had definite views on prestige. When Eisenhower retired, he wrote a series of articles for the Saturday Evening Post. And in one of those articles, he specifically addressed this prestige race. And instead of talking about space, and he mentioned the Soviet Union, and very presciently, he mentioned China in this prestige race. And instead of emphasizing space as a way to polish America's image worldwide, he talked about America's industrial accomplishments, our cars for almost everybody instead of just the favored few, our supermarkets loaded with appetizing food. And then Eisenhower asked rhetorically in this article, what has Soviet Russia or Red China got to compare with these achievements? These might seem like mundane things, our industrial accomplishments, our cars, our supermarkets. But to Eisenhower, these were the things that constituted national greatness. These were the things that could bolster America's prestige on the world stage. And they all reflected the strength of our economy, which to Eisenhower was the sine qua non, the essential thing of being number one in the world. And as for space projects, Eisenhower just didn't accept, at least publicly, the notion that space projects could make the U.S. number one in the world. In particular, he thought human space flight was a waste of taxpayer money. Instead, he supported satellites, robotic vehicles. He thought that they were much more cost-effective. And when people in the 1950s already talked about sending men to the moon, Eisenhower just scoffed. He didn't see the point. And when John F. Kennedy became president, he seemed to agree with Eisenhower about that. At his first press conference, this was Kennedy's second press conference, February 8th, 1961. He was asked about manned spaceflight, and Kennedy responded as follows: "We are very concerned that we do not put a man in space just in order to gain some additional prestige and have a man take a disproportionate risk, even if that means coming in second in putting a man to the space, second to the Soviet Union." Yet despite this, very famously, just 3 months after that press conference, Kennedy went before a joint session of Congress on May 25th, 1961, in a very unusual move, giving a second State of the Union address just a few months after his first State of the Union address, in which Kennedy famously said that America should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely back to Earth. So, that was Kennedy's gauntlet that he threw down to America. Eisenhower was appalled at this. Privately and even publicly, Eisenhower criticized Kennedy's space challenge to America. He thought it was an indulgence that the taxpayer could not afford. At various times he called it nuts, almost hysterical, and a stunt. This is a picture of Eisenhower meeting Kennedy about a month after Kennedy won the 1960 election. And Eisenhower's feelings were very clear in a letter that I found at the Eisenhower Library that he wrote in 1965. Bear in mind, this is just a year and a half after Kennedy was assassinated, when it was almost sacrilegious to criticize Kennedy. But Eisenhower writes to astronaut Frank Borman, "But in 1961, the President of the United States suddenly announced that this nation challenged the Russians to a race to the moon, implying that the prestige of the USA would be riding on the issue. This, I thought, unwise. It immediately took one single project or experiment out of a thoughtfully planned and continuing program involving communication, meteorology, reconnaissance, future military and scientific benefits, and gave the highest priority Unfortunate, in my opinion, to a race. In other words, a stunt. Costs went up drastically. You could see the fiscal conservatism that Eisenhower and Gerald Ford had about the budget. It's possible that even Kennedy himself had these kinds of misgivings that Eisenhower expressed. This is a tape recording from an Oval Office conversation between Kennedy and his NASA administrator, James Webb. This conversation took place on November 21st, 1962, almost a year to the date before Kennedy's assassination. And the context was Webb was protesting to Kennedy that there are other projects that NASA has besides landing men on the moon. And NASA shouldn't put all its eggs in one basket with Project Apollo. There were other projects that were worthy of consideration and investing money and budget money to. And this is the way Kennedy responded to James Webb. This recording is a little more difficult to hear. Do you hear that? This is almost like he said at the end, because we shouldn't be spending this kind of money on Project Apollo, on landing men on the moon, because I'm not that interested in space. This is almost like the smoking gun. In a private, unguarded, very candid moment in the Oval Office, Kennedy reveals his true feelings about space. He wasn't that interested in it. So why did Kennedy show publicly this kind of interest in space? It was because of this Cold War prestige race. For Kennedy, landing men on the moon first, before the Soviet Union, would be like the gold medal in the Cold War prestige race, indicating to nations of the world once and for all, definitively, that the U.S. was far ahead of the Soviet Union in science and technology, winning the space race. That's what was important to Kennedy, and that's why he advocated Project Apollo, despite being not that interested in space by his own admission. It's hard to tell what Eisenhower would have thought about Project Apollo. He died 4 months after Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. My guess is that Eisenhower could be very flexible in his views, and he probably would have come around to accept and cheer landing men on the moon. I think he would have gotten caught up in the goodwill and patriotism and international admiration for America's space program after July 1969. He probably would have acknowledged that the moon landings did, in fact, bolster America's prestige. I think he probably would have changed his mind and seen the effects worldwide of the space race on America's image. He probably would have conceded and acknowledged that. And he probably also would have been envious that it was John F. Kennedy, not Dwight D. Eisenhower, that soaked up all the credit for that and for NASA. So Eisenhower, I think, would have changed his mind on that. But there are a lot of principles that Eisenhower would not have changed his mind on then or today. I think Eisenhower would have opposed the space shuttle as a poor use of taxpayer money. There's talk today about landing men and women on Mars. Eisenhower would scoff at that as a waste of taxpayer money. He would be much more supportive of Project Rover, robotic exploration of Mars and other planets. Going back to that slide that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation, that list of the top 10 skyscrapers in the world today, Eisenhower would probably look at that and shrug his shoulders and bring out his old remark that the U.S. cannot be first in everything. You have to pick the things that are truly important, that truly reflect the strength of America, especially its economy, and make sure you're first on those. Above all, Eisenhower would stress running federal budget surpluses, having a strong economy with low inflation and low unemployment, having an abundance of consumer goods for America. Because in the end, it was the economic race that won the Cold War for this country. Eisenhower would probably say, just look around you. Look at everything that you enjoy as Americans, the seemingly mundane things that you might take for granted, the grocery stores that are filled with shelves, these huge hardware stores that are filled with every imaginable good, car dealerships stocked with cars of various different ranges that Americans can buy, a gallon of gas that sells cheaper here than it does in Asia or Europe, affordable homes for most Americans, a highway system named after Eisenhower that can take Americans to virtually any corner of this country. These are the small things, I'm sure Eisenhower would argue, that collectively constitute the American dream and the strengths of America today. These are the things that make America #1 in the world today. Far more than space spectaculars, landing men on the moon, new space missions, the International Space Station, or anything else. These, Eisenhower would argue today, are the things that boost American prestige. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you very much. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take questions from any of you. We have a microphone there.
Hi, I have one other suggestion as to why perhaps the Navy, rather than the Air Force, with their Jupiter Seas, was chosen. And that is, the Army program was Werner von Braun's program with his German colleagues, the inventor of the B-2 rocket. And this is only 12 years after the end of World War II. So that may have been part of it, wanted to show more as a civilian and non-German accomplishment. But my main question is, in 20 years after 1960 election, you had the 1980 election, in which Ronald Reagan essentially pulled a Kennedy, talking about how weak the United States was militarily. And this was still during the Iranian hostage crisis. And not only proposed, but when he became elected, did massive military spending because the U.S. was thought to be at a disadvantage compared to the Russians, even though people who analyzed Russians' militaries might said that they weren't as strong as Mr. Reagan had indicated.
I'll address both of those points. First of all, you're absolutely right about the lingering animus toward Germans as one of many factors that Eisenhower accepted. There was a committee called the Stewart Committee. It was a 5-person committee set up to explore this concept of which satellite to use. The Navy's candidate for the IGY, the Project Vanguard, or the Army's Project Orbiter. The predominant reason was the civilian flavor of the Navy's satellite. The Jupiter C was already a military satellite. It was used in Huntsville, Alabama. In fact, if you want another indication of the lingering animus toward Germans, people called Huntsville Hunsville, because there were so many German rocket scientists, including Werner von Braun, in Huntsville. The Project Orbiter was already tainted by a military flavor to its development and its use. And Eisenhower wanted to establish the peaceful uses of satellite. And it was a very effective strategy indicating to the nations of the world that the U.S. was a peace-loving nation, but it did end up backfiring on Eisenhower. Very well-intentioned. It didn't matter to him that the U.S. would be second to the Soviet Union. He had gotten warnings that the nation, including from Werner von Braun, that the nation that launches the first world satellite would achieve a tremendous coup in prestige. But Eisenhower felt, first of all, Eisenhower discounted that. And he made a narrative judgment there. But secondly, he thought that the U.S. satellite, the Vanguard, would be so technologically and scientifically superior to anything else that any nation, especially the Soviet Union, could furnish, that the scientific harvest from Project Vanguard would bolster American prestige. Now, to your second point about Reagan in the 1980s, I think Eisenhower would have been, well, I interviewed for this book Harold Brown, who was chief of the Pentagon's research agency in the 1960s. And it's very clear to members of the Carter administration that Jimmy Carter hasn't gotten credit for many of the military advances like stealth technology, the cruise missile, that Carter approved in the late 1970s. So that's one thing. And I think Eisenhower would be very upset at the extent of defense spending in the 1980s. Eisenhower believed in sufficiency. And he, being a former general, being somebody who devoted most of his career to the military, almost his entire career to the military, he knew the Pentagon's game. Give them more money, give them more hardware, more goods, more tanks, more missiles, more ships, and they would be pleased. And Eisenhower could inoculate himself against the Pentagon's demands by saying, look, I'm from a military background. I know how much you need and how much you don't need. And here's where we're going to stop military spending at $40 billion a year. That was about the limit that Eisenhower wanted to spend. And it helped him run 3 budget surpluses during his 8-year presidency. That was a signal achievement that we didn't see again until the 1990s, the late 1990s. Incidentally, since we're in Gerald Ford's library, President Ford was also very upset at Reagan's charges, which cast an umbrella over the whole 1970s, that the 70s presidents were negligent in military spending and allowed the U.S. to fall behind the Soviet Union in its defense. So I think Eisenhower was very much in favor of a strong defense, a defense second to none. He got actually very angry if anybody charged that he had been remiss in national security, but he believed also that an important part of national defense was the national economy. And in turn, an important part of the national economy was running federal budget surpluses and limiting federal spending. So Eisenhower was shrewd enough and interested in economics enough to keep those things in mind as he set a blueprint for the nation to follow in its budget, its military, its space exploration, and all the rest. So that's the way I'd answer the 2 parts of your question.
First of all, if somehow I had been able to read your book when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, I wouldn't have been as worried about the Soviet space program as I was when I was building my models of rockets and reading about the astronauts and boys' life. So appreciate that. And something when I read your book, it didn't strike me until you mention it now, that the press is always concerned about the horse race more than they are about policies, presidential elections, space race, or whatever. My question really is this: about a third of the way through the book, you said Eisenhower followed the cardinal rule of presidential crises: stay ahead of the public opinion, shape it, not react to it. And while he seemed to do that in many, many ways, I'm just curious why space was an exception. I know you touched on it, and considering that, as you said, he was pretty media savvy as a general during World War II, and working with the commanders from the other nations, and that he seemed to have a real grasp of what he needed to say or not say, such as his comments to the paratroopers before D-Day and all that. And this just intrigues me that this seems to be an exception to so much else that was part of his handling of the presidency.
Another excellent question. Eisenhower did try to stay above and shape public opinion after Sputnik with, for example, those television talks. I think this is one thing that the media likes to do. Gloom and doom stories actually sell. And the media was very conscious. You saw this in television media as well as print media and radio media, portraying the U.S. as behind the Soviet Union. Bad news sells. Conspiracy theories sell. President Ford was very upset at Oliver Stone and Oliver Stone's JFK and other reports about conspiracy theories of the JFK assassination, and he knew it was partly to make a buck on the Kennedy assassination. So this is the way the media generates sales. I think Eisenhower was not a media-savvy presidency. He didn't come from a political background. In my book, I draw a contrast between him and Kennedy. Kennedy might have gone on to become a journalist had his older brother, Joe Jr., not died in World War II during that bombing mission over Europe. And Kennedy came from a journalist background. He had a journalist touch. Jackie Kennedy also was a journalist and writer. So Kennedy knew what made good copy. Eisenhower wasn't like that. And in addition, space wasn't a high priority for Eisenhower. He gave it more short shrift versus things like arms control with the Soviet Union, the budget control, keeping a low inflation economy. Those things interested him more and more. Foreign crises like in Lebanon in 1956. So presidents have to set priorities. You can't accomplish everything. And an effective president will set a limited agenda and go after that agenda. And Eisenhower's priorities were a reflection of his man and of the man and what he wanted to accomplish as president. Arms control with the Soviet Union, a strong economy, and space wasn't nearly as high. So that was another reason why Eisenhower wasn't as enthusiastic about trumpeting America's space feats and accomplishments, which were significant during his presidency. And he fell victim to media characterizations that the U.S. was woefully behind the Soviet Union. And although he tried, he was never able to get completely ahead of the curve in this perception. I should add that Eisenhower had scheduled a third address to the nation after Sputnik, but he had to cancel it because he suffered a mini stroke. And it was an unwise decision to scrap those talks. I think if he had continued it, he could have kept up with some of the momentum that he generated from doing those talks. It was a good start, a task left unfinished.
There are science writers who have written that the U.S. could have launched a satellite a full 7 years before Sputnik. Wernher von Braun wanted to launch a satellite by accident, and he was ordered not to. This should be remembered. I also wanted to say about JFK's, you say that he was not interested in space. At first, he wasn't that interested, but many astronauts who met Kennedy personally and were invited to the White House have said in interviews time after time that Kennedy was a real space cadet. He was very interested. The questions he asked were not the kind of questions they normally got from politicians. They were insightful, intelligent questions that he was very interested. I don't think you can quote one statement from one interview at a certain point in somebody's life and say this is the final word on Kennedy's lack or interest in space. I just don't think that's very fair. And also, I would also submit that JFK could also be characterized as a fiscal conservative. He was not a person who was interested in spending a lot of money just here and there. So if you could.
Okay, the first point of your question is accurate, and I do mention in my book that it was General John Medeiros whom you're referring to. You said that he was ordered, von Braun was ordered. The person who ordered him was General John Medeiros. He was head of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency in Huntsville, and he did order von Braun specifically not to launch a satellite using a fourth stage of the Jupiter C rocket. And they kept a Jupiter C handy in case they received orders from the Eisenhower administration to launch. And they were upset when they made repeated requests to the White House that we can launch, let's do it. And the Eisenhower administration turned down each request. Ironically, though, it was finally, and I detail this in my book, it was finally the Jupiter C rocket that launched Explorer 1. They tried launching a Vanguard in early December 1957, and it crashed, it toppled over at the launch pad. It was very embarrassing, and American prestige at that point seemed to hit a nadir. And so at that point, and Eisenhower is very strangely silent in his memoirs about why he changed his mind and decided to give the okay to the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, but that was the fact. And I think you could say that Eisenhower tacitly conceded that the U.S. had to do something, and the way to do something was to get something up as soon as possible with the Jupiter-C rocket. Now, as to your second point, it is true, and I interviewed NASA engineers for this project, and one of them I remember saying, "We love Kennedy." He helped raise civilian pay grades for NASA engineers. He visited NASA just a week before, Cape Canaveral, just a week before his assassination, and seemed genuinely to enjoy the trip, as did Eisenhower when he visited Cape Canaveral and also the Huntsville facility, which he visited in September and renamed the George Marshall Flight Center. Eisenhower was responsible for that. But it is true, and it's not just one statement, that Kennedy, in a number of occasions, said that he would rather be spending the money on domestic programs like food stamps and welfare and Social Security rather than on space. Space, it all boils down to what I mentioned to you, priorities. Space wasn't that high on Kennedy's list of priority. There were a number of reasons, besides just the prestige race, that Kennedy had this quick evolution in his thinking. One was his competitive nature. I mean, he grew up with his brothers being lectured by Joseph P. Kennedy that coming in second was as good as coming in last. So Kennedy had a very competitive nature, and the last thing he wanted to do was come in second to the Russians. In fact, as one illustration of his competitive nature, I have a little anecdote in my book that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was playing chess with one of his aides, Paul Fay, and it was clear that Kennedy was going to lose the chess match, and he deliberately upset the board. And Paul Fay was his Undersecretary of the Navy, and he said, "Well, Paul, it's one of those tragedies of life. Now we'll never know whether the Undersecretary of Navy was about to strategically outmaneuver the Commander-in-Chief." So, Kennedy didn't like to lose. But there were two other things that caused Kennedy to change his mind. And they both happened between that Kennedy coming to office and that little segment from his February 8, 1961 press conference and the May 25, 1961 second State of the Union address. There are two things that happened, both in April. One was Yuri Gagarin, which some observers said had an impact that was even worse than Sputnik, because it was putting a human in space. And secondly, the Bay of Pigs, which left the Kennedy administration with a black eye and needing to achieve the high ground again. But up until space, when Kennedy was a senator, there was a Boston tavern that he used to frequent, and one bartender remembered Kennedy going into the bar, engaging in debates with other bar patrons, and diminishing the importance of space, scoffing at space. And it may have been John F. Kennedy trying to provoke an argument, but it may also have reflected what Kennedy felt about space. And there are many public statements that are consonant with that view. So space, he grew interested in space, but I think it would be unfair to say that he was a gung-ho, all-out space enthusiast. And then your last point about Kennedy being a fiscal conservative, to some extent all presidents, no president likes to see the budget go in red. Even Lyndon Johnson, who ramped up spending for the Vietnam War and the Great Society programs, wanted to contain the budget. But Kennedy, in his public addresses, especially his first State of the Union address, said that it used very martial language, saying that we must do what we have to do, even if it means increased spending to win the Cold War. So it was a change in emphasis from Eisenhower being so wedded to fiscal conservatism. A noted change of evidence if you go back and look at Kennedy's public statements. Next question.
Instead of ask questions, can I give comments and then you be kindly respond my comments? The first comment is thank you for today's wonderful speech, the inspiration and entertainment. I guess that prestige gap, this term by itself describes American history. Recently I fallen in love with that, which is I don't know a whole lot. Compare with what happened during that time and with the situation right now and your lecture, your idea have huge significance, not just the audience. And I think most important is the investors put huge amount of money in China, in other countries, because this prestige and gap. The first thing my comment is that, yes, there is a psychological warfare American is losing. It's not necessarily truly just completely lost, but temporarily it's just a prestige illusion about China and the United States. Secondly, is the gap, the reality, and the understanding and the information just not consistent. So my point, if I may say so, based on what you described the history, is happening right now again. Most not just in the presidents, is the American people and the people outside America. So I would really just say the current situation is we have to get into this information warfare in the right way. Instead of individually against this candidate and this party, this country or that country, let's say that what we can benefit mankind in the short run and long run, like Eisenhower or like JFK. And America right now spend huge amount of money for media, mostly game, entertainment, which is not your entertainment, which is joke. But the true scientist discovery, mainly still is American, pioneered. But it's not, you cannot see it. The TV, you sit over there, 90% is joke, or lie, or it's just pollution, create more gap of prestige and illusion. So
I'll try to answer your question. You're absolutely right. I'll take one more question after this because it is getting late. And if anybody else has questions, I'll take one more. Feel free to come up afterwards because it's getting close to 9 o'clock and all of you have to get home. You're absolutely right. I tried to indicate at the beginning of the talk this idea of economic power, or on other indices perhaps, gold medals, Nobel Prizes, tallest skyscrapers, this prestige race. And you hear different variants of the word prestige. When you hear about global respect for this country, or image, or standing, those are all variants of the word prestige and America's standing in the world. So this prestige race continues. It'll continue for the rest of our lifetime. It'll continue for as long as the United States exists and there are countries in the world. I think presidents like Eisenhower and Ford would be very concerned about America's global standing today. And they would be dismayed, for example, at the impact of the bickering today and the polarization today in Washington and its impact on America's image around the world. One thing that's notable about both Ford and Eisenhower was their ability to reach across the aisle. In fact, in forming NASA, Eisenhower worked very closely with the Senate majority at the time, the Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon B. Johnson. Even on one divisive issue, the formation of a space council, Eisenhower specifically invited Lyndon Johnson to the White House and had drinks together and settled their differences over that. The growth of the budget and the budget deficit would concern Eisenhower and President Ford a lot today. The image of a country that can't get a grip on its own spending diminishes the image of America around the world. There are areas where, when you see these polls that American students are falling behind, ranking 30th or 50th in math and reading and science levels, those things hurt America's prestige. But on the positive side, America still has the #1 economy in the world. Many of the things that Eisenhower pointed out, the consumer products available to, all the comforts that we have as citizens. If you ever travel, these were words spoken by a man who had spent time in Europe, in the Philippines, in Panama, who had lived with Mamie or fought in World War II, lived in Mamie abroad. they're the words of somebody who had been overseas and in other countries and had seen the difference between what we enjoy and over there. The words of a man who spoke from experience. We still have those things today. Our culture, which permeates all corners of the world, be it in our sports, our movies, our songs, that shows the influence of America. And I think in a way, perhaps a way that might not bring comfort to all of us, keeps our influence very strong around the world. And our universities still, I mean, University of Michigan and other internationally renowned institutions attract students worldwide. And these are the things. And Eisenhower, another reaction of Eisenhower after Sputnik was to sign, in a bipartisan effort, the National Defense Education Act to encourage science and math and foreign language education in this country. So these are the things that Eisenhower would pour his efforts into to try to bolster American prestige. But at the same time, if he were around today, he would be concerned at some of the things that he sees.
Just a comment about the Vanguard. I can remember specifically sitting in front of the TV watching the catastrophe as the Vanguard toppled over and blew up. I do not remember anything, maybe I was too young, about Eisenhower saying anything about that, did he?
As far as I know, Eisenhower was quite silent about that. His memoirs are silent, his public statements were silent about it. You know, Eisenhower had a Latin inscription on his desk, gentle in manner, strong in deed. He was a president who liked to work behind the scenes, and he could be taciturn sometime, but this perhaps goes back to his administration not being as political and public relations savvy as it could have and indeed should have been. He had an effective press secretary in James Haggerty, a former New York Times newsman, but in many inflection points in the Eisenhower presidency, Eisenhower did not reach out to Americans publicly as he should have, and it would have made his job easier. Because when you have to fight the tide of public opinion, media opinion, and congressional opinion, it makes your job as president tougher, god-awfully tougher sometimes. And so Eisenhower could have had a much easier second term, and in fact, it translated into physical difficulties. I mean, I don't think it's any accident that his mini stroke that he suffered on November 25th, 1957, came just a couple months after two very difficult incidents, Little Rock and Sputnik. So it did translate into a medical malady for Eisenhower, in addition to the political difference. His public opinion also started to dip below 60% for the first time in his presidency due to these incidents and also to the worst recession up until that time, 57, 58, in the post-World War II period. So these were tough years for Dwight D. Eisenhower. He rebounded and was able to leave office in good standing and still has today the highest average public approval rating for a two-term president, 64%. But especially after Sputnik, his job was pretty tough. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I want to thank Yanek for coming back to the Ford Library, and we have for him a commemorative set of two new biographies about President Ford. They were both published in 2013, and the authors of each will be coming, which I'll tell you in just a moment. So thank you so much.
Thanks,
this was
Elaine.
fantastic.
Thanks
and
so much.
We're really glad to have you.
Thank you for this, too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
As usual, I'd like to give you a brief commercial for upcoming programs. We will have on Thursday, February 20th, here at the library, Peter Baker from the New York Times talking about a newly released book, Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House. I know you'll want to be here for that. On March 26th, we're going to continue our centennial coverage and have, frankly, present rescheduled programs. These were programs that had to be canceled due to the federal government shutdown when we had to go dark for those awful days. We're going to have, there's a new biography, one of which I just gave to Yanek. Gerald Ford, An Honorable Life, is by James Cannon, the late James Cannon. This is his second biography. The book was completed with an afterword by one of his sons, Scott, And we're having the other, Scott and his brother Jim, come to talk about the book. Their dad knew President Ford for, 50, 60, 70 years of overlapping careers. So, he writes wonderfully. And that program will be moderated by Professor Barry Rabe of the Ford School of Public Policy. If you can't come to it that night on the 26th, we're doing it the night before at the museum in Grand Rapids. So if you're inclined in that direction, you can join us there. We have other things happening at the museum for those of you who migrate in that direction. February 18th, Rick Borum is author of a new biography on young Jerry Ford, did some very interesting interviews going back 10 and 15 years. I learned things and I had to ask him, how did you know that? That's not in the documents. Well, he learned some things by talking to President Ford's brother and so forth. So that'll be an interesting program. And on the 25th, we're having Eric Draper, who was President Bush's lead photographer. He's a wonderful speaker, and that will be a great program. And looking ahead to April, Betty Ford's birthday, the foundation is organizing to bring in Rosalind Carter to speak. And Joe, is that a luncheon program?
There'll be a luncheon.
A luncheon program in downtown Grand Rapids, probably at one of the hotels across the river is usually our format. So that will be a wonderful day. So we have lots going on at the Ford Library and Museum coming in 2014, and other things kind of still in the pipeline. Again, if you're not a friend of Ford, I hope you'll talk to Joe and consider picking up literature in the lobby, because that is our funding source. It's not the federal government pays our salaries and maintains the buildings, but it's really the foundation that's our core support for public programming. So check out the Gerald Ford Centennial exhibit in the library, have a cookie and something to drink, meet our guest speaker, and pick up a book. I know many of you already have, and have a chance to ask him more questions. So thanks so much for coming.